Good morning. This snowy morning in the spring. So I'll start talking about the fourth paramita, which is Virya, which means effort or zeal or vitality. And Aiken Roshi analyzed the etymology of Virya as it made its way from Sanskrit to Chinese to Japanese, and he came up with this powerful definition: the advancement of single-minded spiritual vigor. Single-minded spiritual vigor. And when you nurture that single-minded spiritual vigor, then there's nothing that can stop it, that can prevent it from advancing. So Virya is not only the intention to realize the Buddha way, but the energy is always there to realize that intention. So I'm going to bring up this koan again that Aiken mentioned in the Shishin last weekend. It's case 98 of the Book of Equanimity, where a monk asked Tozan, among the three bodies, which one does not fall into any category? And Tozan said, as to this, I always take heed. So always take heed. Years ago, a friend of mine, as many years ago actually, became a Hare Krishna devotee. And his mother was very upset that he had forsaken his childhood religion, had shaved his head, except for the top knot, and wore colorful clothes, and sang and danced beating a tambourine. And his mother implored him to come to church with her, and he asked her a simple question. He said, do you think of God all the time? And of course, if we lead busy lives, we can't think of God all the time. But he was totally devoted to Krishna, and he did. He thought of God all the time. And he was a bit rude to his mother, who I also knew, and he said, what do you think of more, God or money? So the question is, how far do you let your single-minded spiritual vigor stray? Do you always keep it in sight, like you would a 2-year-old child in a crowd? And if you don't pay attention to that child, they'll disappear. One time I took my 3 sons to an air show in San Diego County, and it was the biggest crowd of people I've ever been in. I think it was 500,000 people, 500,000 people were at this air show. And my 2 older sons were teenagers, but my youngest son was probably about 3 or 4 years old. And I can't tell you how many times my heart leapt when I turned around and not see him, but there would be this mass of people. And so I had to employ my older sons to help me keep an eye on the youngest one, because he wasn't paying heed. So we had to. So one of the things I like to do is take inspiration from our spiritual ancestors. And Dogen wrote this fascicle called Continuous Practice, and he gives examples of continuous practice. And of course, it starts with the Buddha. It said that he practiced for several lifetimes, but then when he was Prince Siddhartha, he left the palace and spent his life in mountains or monasteries, and he never wore new clothes and begged for his food, and he taught continuously for over 40 years. And his successor, Mahakashapa, was an exemplary monk. He didn't own a thing and never indulged in invitations by lay people. He took his clothes from dead bodies in the charnel grounds, and he never lay down to sleep. He did zazen all night. And then the sixth patriarch, was a woodcutter, and he left his aged mother to enter the monastery of Hyungjen. And Dogen said he thought it was easier for Bodhidharma's disciple, Waco. You may know the story. He cut off his arm to show his sincerity. Dogen thought it was easier for Waco to cut off his arm than for Huineng to leave his mother. And of course, there's a famous quote from Master Hyakujo, who said that a day of no work is a day of no eating. You might remember that story where he was growing old and he used to always go out in the field, and his monks were worried about his health, so they hid all of his tools. And then he went on a hunger strike. and that's what he said to them: a day of no work is a day of no eating. So Master Joshu, as many of you know, is one of my favorites. He started studying with Nansen when he was a teenager. He was a young man. And he might have been 19 or 20. And he studied with Nansen for 40 years, till Nansen died. And he was 60 years old. And he was a very well accomplished practitioner. And Nansen, of course, had fully empowered him to be a teacher, but he decided that he wasn't really ripe enough, mature enough to teach and have his own center, so he went on a pilgrimage. And he told himself that if he met a child who could teach him, he would learn from that child. And if he met an old, wise person who could learn from him, he would teach that person. So he traveled around China and tested his understanding against other famous masters. And his pilgrimage lasted for 20 years. He was 80 years old. And then he finally decided that he was ready to teach at his own center. And according to his biography, he lived another 40 years. And he taught until he's 120 years old. He's one of our most famous Zen masters. The famous koan of There's a Dog Have Buddha Nature, that's Master Joshu, who said Mu. So he maintained, that you know, single-minded spiritual vigor for 100 years. So there's many stories of like this, of continuous practice, continuous effort, meticulous effort to improve one's understanding, to improve one's awareness, mindfulness, insight. But at the end, what do they get? What do they obtain? Because they don't get a diploma to indicate that they've accomplished such and such and done so many years of practice. But their own life was a result of their practice. How they were, what they were like, how they interacted, what they contributed to others. So we shouldn't get stuck on what we think results should be like, what our expectations are. For example, all of us want to be able to sit along Sesshin without any pain. That's the result we want from our practice. You know, I know that I always have. But I realized years ago that there's no such thing as that in my life. It doesn't exist. We think if we had that, then Sesshin would be wonderful, no problem. So even though we sit hard, and even though we may not want to, or we may not expect to, we keep encountering all kinds of obstacles. It could be in our mind, it could be in our body, it could be in our emotions, it could be our thoughts. When we first encounter the practice, there's a lot of enthusiasm, and then certain obstacles come up, and how do we deal with them? You know, so we start to complain about it. I remember somebody telling me who was a student of Trungpa Rinpoche, they went to him and they said, "My meditation is really boring." And Trungpa Rinpoche said, "Oh, now you're really starting to practice." When it's exciting and all of that, you know, we haven't really settled in, it's when we start coming up against these barriers. And we begin to think that our practice isn't very pure. But that's what practice is, you know. We keep coming up against ourselves in different ways. And Suzuki Roshi, the founder of the San Francisco Zen Center, wrote in one of his books, "You can't make an impure thing to be pure." And what he means by purity is that everything is as it is. So if you think that you're going to get something from Zazen, you're already making it impure. Because there's nothing to get. But on the other hand, there's a lot of things to let go of. And when you let go, then what you're trying to get reveals itself. So it's not obtaining things, it's releasing things, releasing. Of course, we always use the analogy of the clouds and the sun. The sun's always shining. It's just we obscure it, and that's what we do with our practice too. So Dogen said, exerting oneself meticulously and unceasingly in practice is called meticulous effort. He says, be precise, not careless. Proceed forward, do not regress. I think Rinzai said, don't wobble. It's kind of a nice word, wobbling. And the Buddha said that if you students exert meticulous effort, nothing will be difficult to accomplish. So he said, make an effort to practice carefully. He said it's like when water flows constantly against a big rock. Even a small amount of water will eventually dig out a large hole. But if one whose practice becomes lax, it will be impossible to accomplish anything. It's like trying to start a fire by rubbing two sticks together. And if you stop rubbing before the wood gets hot, you can't start a fire. So this is what is meant by meticulous effort. Now there's various kinds of effort. One is to be constant and steady and precise. Now, when railroads were first being built in this country, they didn't have a standard width between the two rails. You probably heard of narrow gauge railroads, but there was a different gauge coming from the East Coast, and so they couldn't connect. You had to change from one kind of a railroad car to another kind and another engine, and they go. But so they have to be the same width, the entire length. So they have to be constant. And so that's like our practice. If we're not constant, if we keep changing it, keep changing our practice from this to that to this to that to this, then we won't be able to traverse the entire length of the rails. And you know what requires more meticulous effort than anything? And Todd knows, computer programming. I've worked in computers a lot, and so has Yugen, and Todd has too, I know. I mean, they don't tolerate any sloppiness at all. I mean, they're very meticulous. I mean, if you have even one period in the wrong place, the computer program won't work. I'm never amazed when software doesn't work. I'm just amazed when it does. Yeah. I'm not saying we should be like computers, or even like beasts of burden, or assembly line workers that just keep trudging along step after step until they fall from exhaustion. See, the effort that we make should be tempered by some kind of insight or vision, so we have a clear view of why we're practicing, what our intention is, what our purpose is. What is this practice about? Why am I sitting? And when we have good determination and good faith, then we can continue with meticulous effort. So each one of us has to realize that for ourselves. Now, other than being constant, we have to really pay attention to details, to the fine points. of our practice. I remember years and years ago, we at the Zen Center of Los Angeles, we used to have these community work practice days, and I remember one particular work day, I was assigned to hem curtains that were going to be put in some room in the Sangha house, and Maizumi Roshi was also hemming curtains with me. And I was really carefully gauging each stitch. I'm not a very good seamstress, so I wanted them to be all the same, width and length. I wanted it all to look perfect, and I was going like this. And Maizumi Roshi had his curtains there, and he was going, and I was going, and finally he said, "Hurry up!" And I said, "Well, I want to make it look good." And he said, "Look, nobody's going to see that part of the curtain when it's hanging. Just get it done." So paying attention to detail, we have to think, what is the practice? I mean, we have 5 acres of land here that we want to make it look good. But if I spent 8 hours weeding 10 square feet of land, by the time I start working on the next 10 feet, the first 10 square feet are going to have weeds again, So we have to be aware of what we're doing. Like Dogen said, he said, when the cart does not go, do you whip the cart or the horse? Just have to be attentive. And there's a Zen story too, about Master Basho and Master Nangaku, where Master Basho was sitting in Zazen. And Master Nangaku said, "What are you doing?" And he said, "I'm sitting to become Buddha." And Master Nangaku took up a piece of tile, and then he started rubbing it with a stone, and Basho looked over and said, "What are you doing?" And he says, "I'm rubbing this tile to make it into a mirror." And he said, "You can't make that tile into a mirror by rubbing it." And he said, "How do you expect to become a Buddha by sitting Zazen?" He's not saying don't sit Zazen, but why are you sitting? See? He's trying to, again, get something. That's not exerting meticulous effort. Trying to get something. What he needs to do is let go and let the Buddha reveal itself. Not trying to go after it. And Master Dogen said, one day of continuous practice by us becomes the seeds of all the Buddhas. Well, you might say, I can't practice continuously. I can't continue under all circumstances. But if you can do it for one moment, just one moment, the amount of time it takes you to blink your eyes, then you can do it continuously. If you can do it in one moment, why can't you do it in the next moment? And in the moment after that? And so forth. That's why Dogen said, one day of continuous practice becomes the seed of all the Buddhas. He says one day, but it could be one moment. And that's the seed. So in thinking about meticulous effort, there's a very close connection with discipline. And in thinking about discipline, for me, there's a very close connection with freedom. So when we think about our practice, one way to express it is to be free, not to be encumbered by all kinds of obstacles, all kinds of difficulties, all kinds of prejudices and unspoken beliefs. To make ourselves really free, we don't get hung up in all kinds of ways. So in this country, there's a tendency to think to be free is to be able to do whatever we want, whenever we want to do it. You know, in the 60s, it meant just to hang out and space out. That was being free. See, but I know each one of us has developed some kind of a discipline, whether it be computer programming or accounting, management, dancing, sports, musical instruments. So if you want to really excel in that, you have to be well disciplined. And when you're well disciplined, then you have the freedom to improvise, to create. But in our practice, what are we talking about is disciplining the mind so that the mind doesn't control us. All of the belief systems, the habits that we have, just to uncover them, that's part of meticulous effort, to bring them to light and then to release them. So then we can be free. So some of you know the story that comes from Master Hakuin about the difference between the person who makes the effort and the person who doesn't make steady effort. And in his metaphor, he's talking about the seashore and the ocean is a source of self-awareness or enlightenment. And in order to experience it, one has to dip one's fingers into the ocean and taste the salt of the ocean to really experience it. And he said if someone lives right on the seashore and doesn't make the effort to go down and taste the salt, then they won't experience it. And someone who lives thousands of miles away in the mountains, who walks steadily in the direction of the ocean, will reach that place and can dip the fingers in and taste it. It's about steadiness in this continuous, determined effort he's talking about. But like the example I gave with my Shishin Roshi, we can carry anything to its extreme. You know? I mean, I've been in Zen centers where people are so careful about everything they do. It's almost like a robot, you know? When the period ends, you know, we all rise and bow to our cushion and then get ready for hear the clapper to start kinhin, walking meditation. I've seen people when at the end of the period they have to move every time a certain way, stretch, swing, but then they're always the last one to stand up. And then when we sit down, they have to adjust their robes and everything this way, you know. Maybe once, 5 years ago, they had a great experience, you know, when they put their legs in their robes in a certain way and they're just trying to recreate it. It's like a baseball pitcher. There was a guy who played a pitcher for the New York Giants back in the 50s. His name was Sal Magley. They called him the barber because he never shaved before his game, and he always had a little beard, and that was, he, you know, superstitious. So we can become stiff too in the effort, but how to really be flow freely. We have to be aware of the circumstances. So when I'm talking about continuous effort or meticulous effort or single-minded spiritual vigor, they're all the same thing. It's just about being attentive. Every moment, in every place. Just always take heed. And that's what our practice is.